Thank you, Kevin. Thank you guys for showing up for UXIFY. So Kevin gave a great little intro, so it kind of defeats the purpose of this slide. I'm really trying to bulk up my slide deck, so you've kind of heard my tenure. Just to give you a bit more depth on that, my team is comprised of a bunch of developers who work with designers. So we understand the limitations that you're going to be running into. A lot of our clients recently are going from desktop environments to web and to mobile. So we're trying to help them with that transition, and we're trying to guide them through the pitfalls that they'll run into, the ways that we'll need to work together between design and development to change around the use cases so that they make sense in these new environments and in these new platforms. So a series of tubes, I'm not really sure if anybody remembers that anecdote or that euphemism. It was from back in 2006. A senator was talking about net neutrality and kind of used the term, the phrase, the internet is not a big truck, it's a series of tubes. Now, while that euphemism actually fits, while that metaphor fits, the anecdote that he used kind of highlighted the fact that he really had no idea how the internet worked. He referred to a staffer of his sending him an internet, which we kind of assumed to be an email, but we really don't know. But the actual metaphor, a series of tubes, does fit when we describe the internet. And the reason being is because we describe our connection as a pipe. Everybody refers to their internet connection almost like a pipe, and that deals with bandwidth. How much information are we sending across the wire, across the air, whatever our connection protocol happens to be. But beyond bandwidth, which is, obviously the speed, the overall speed of our connection, we're also dealing with something called latency. Now, the connections that we've had over time, from going from a hardwired connection to Wi-Fi to cell signals, have kind of spoiled us. So they've kind of given us all the information that we wanted, given it as fast as we wanted it. The request times are fast, and all the data that you're being sent over is quick as well. So we've kind of gone from a first to worst situation. And I know that we have somebody here from AT&T. It's not a dig at you. Don't raise my cell bill. I actually was going to call them out specifically, but I blurted out once I looked at the speaker list. So again, we've been spoiled. We've gone from a hardwired connection. We've gotten all these things, and every step of the way, every piece of the puzzle that we move further on out, we're increasing our latency and we're decreasing our bandwidth. So that has a lot of effect on what we're going to be doing as far as an application is concerned. We want to make sure that the amount and the volume that we're sending over is small and manageable for our end users and in the platform and devices that we're dealing with. So a lot of times you're used to your LOB application, your line of business application. It's got millions of records, hundreds of thousands of data points. But how do we deal with that in a mobile environment or a browser environment? And what are we dealing with as far as our limitations are concerned? So a lot of the ways that we handle a solution like this is we go to the kind of savior du jour, which is responsive design. Gives us the ability to kind of design once and deal with all of these problems all in one fell swoop. So we're dealing with a design for a desktop that can deal with a smaller resolution tablet that can then deal with a smaller resolution phone. But the problem is that this is not a solution for everything, because it doesn't take into account the fact that we're still making the same amount of requests that we did on a desktop, but we're also doing it on the phone. So we're hitting that latency problem over and over and over again. And the amount of information that we're sending over, for instance, I believe that your average website page is rapidly approaching 2 megs in size, which is, again, manageable on a desktop environment. But when you're on a phone, it's really unacceptable. And a lot of that information happens to be in images. And are we really giving our end users the same experience that they really need on a phone? We don't need a full-fat, full-resolution image. We don't need a lot of overhead when we're going and desiccating that web full desktop resolution image and page and UI over to a minimized phone environment. So one of the alternatives that we have, something called REST. which is basically just responsive design plus server side. This doesn't really concern you guys too much as the design community, but it is something that you can bring up with the developers that you're working with. And what this gives them the opportunity to do is query the devices that are being used that are, trying to take your responsive design and only sending over the assets that they really need to see on a mobile device. So that way you're not choking the connection, you're not sitting there with users who are waiting for a minute just for images to show, when really all they really are concerned about is the information that they want to deal with and that they want to interact with. So going with that data, one of our biggest problems of going from desktop to web, just from the browser's sake, and then again over into mobile, is our data density. So I mentioned and touched upon a little earlier about millions of records, millions of data points. That's what our end users and we ourselves are used to dealing with on a desktop application. So everybody kind of feels that no matter where I'm going and working with this application and working with this data, I want that same experience. I want to work with that millions of records all the time, no matter what kind of device. But it's up to you guys as designers to kind of mutate and change around those use cases and change around those workflows so that the developer community can make it possible to send over that data and allow our users to work with it a little bit better. So aside from data density, we kind of want to make sure that we're taking advantage of any lazy loading capabilities that we have, whatever our platform happens to be. So if we're dealing with a web environment, purely on a desktop, we have a little bit more latitude. You have, potentially a better connection. You have, a lot more screen real estate. You might be dealing with a keyboard and mouse. So it becomes a little bit easier to manipulate with these large amounts of records, large amounts of data points. However, you then translate that over to a tablet or a phone environment, and you know that you have to really bring this down. You're not going to be able to see a million data points in a chart inside of your phone. You're not going to be able to work with that easily. So working, again, between design and development, which is something that Kevin and I have done over the past couple years, and Tobias, the former director of UX over here, something that we'd worked on as well. So it's very important that you work together with your developers to understand what the limitations are on a platform by platform basis. And that means involving them earlier on, so that way they can be almost part of the user interviews to understand, again, the environments that you're going to be dealing with. So getting that data over to your device is one step of the battle, but nobody's just sitting there staring at this information as it came across the wire. They want to do something with it. So they're going to want to be able to filter. They're going to want to be able to sort, modify any type of this information. So again, you're now not only beholden to the connection, now you're going down into the device limitations. So you're dealing with, if it's a phone or a tablet, really minimal amounts of executable memory. So you're not, again, going to be able to store millions of records on this device and be able to work with it all at once. If you're dealing with something that might be graphically intensive, again, on a desktop, we're dealing with very good processors. There might be a graphics coprocessor on there. There might be dedicated graphics. So again, if you're dealing with heavy visualization, you have a lot of latitude on a desktop. But again, the further and further out you go, when you're going over into a browser or if you're going onto a mobile device, you're dealing with a lot more of a limitation as far as what you have available to you when it comes to the resources on a given machine. So again, you want to make sure that you're presenting, working with development, trying to understand what are the ways that we can change and modify this use case so that way we're not just moving people along and grabbing and copying that same use case over into a mobile device where it's just not going to translate very well. So I titled this slide the Google effect, and the way that I interpret this to mean is that we often run into either clients, coworkers, who are trying to solve a problem, and it looks very similar to something that Google or another marquee company has run into or done or dealt with, and it looks very smooth and handled very professionally and smoothly. However, very often we are not working with the benefit of Google's massive mound of cash. We don't have the time that they might have. We don't have the personnel that they might have. But what we do have is legacy data. We have legacy systems. We have use cases that have a few intricacies that might change what we're doing compared to what Google does. Now what a lot of these companies do is provide APIs that allow us to kind of hook into what they've done and the intelligence of what they've created in the past. We can hook into those, but again, we're dealing with situations with legacy products that don't allow us to hook into all of those things and use the same solutions over and over and over again. So one of the things that we have as an alternative, as a possibility of working with, is a hybrid. So, and this specifically is within the mobile device sphere. A lot of people have the question of, all right, do I go native or do I go in a web solution? And a lot of people want to avoid going in a web solution. You don't want your users to fire up a web page. It's a more clunky of user interface. People like to run an app. If they're going to be running something on their phone and they're going to be running it very frequently, they prefer an app-based environment. They don't want to have something that's going to be loading up assets over and over and over again. So a hybrid essentially just takes your HTML, takes your CSS and everything that you've designed and created, wraps that in an app container, a native container. So this gives you the ability to push all of the assets, all of the support structure onto the device ahead of time. So the only thing that you're sending over the air or over the wire is just the data. So it gives you that ability, again, to kind of get closer and closer to a more native environment, as opposed to going through the process of having to create a specifically native app for every single platform that you happen to be on. And again, because you have a native container, you can take advantage of access to hardware, which means that you can run this app on a background and load in data that might be more massive. So that way, a user could potentially work with this offline. They might be able to work with a larger data set. So again, you have a few more capabilities when working with mobile devices and with browsers that you might not have been aware of prior. So things like lazy loading, things like working with a hybrid environment will allow you to deal with those limitations in a much more fluid fashion. So this is essentially the length and breadth of this talk. I know that it is mercifully short for all of you who have been here for the full 5 hours. So I will now open it up to the floor. I know that I've kind of breezed through a lot of those questions a lot of those topics pretty quickly. So if you guys have any questions, I'll throw it over to the floor now.
Of course, thank you. Somebody must have a development question.
These are designers. They don't care about developers at all. That's our problem.
Wait. Bring a microphone over.
There is no such thing as a stupid question.
Okay. So how hard is lazy loading to implement?
Lazy loading where?
To implement in general.
So lazy loading to implement in general, that was a question. How hard is it? How long does it take? It really is all dependent. It's kind of case dependent on the application that you're dealing with. But in general, these are problems that have been solved many, many times. So it should be relatively easy for a development team to implement lazy loading. Again, it really depends. Are they working with a chart? Are they working with a grid? What kind of legacy systems are you dealing with? So a lot of those things kind of go into that consideration. But the whole problem of lazy loading, whether it's on a web browser on the desktop or if it's on a phone device, these are all problems that have been solved. So that should not be a stumbling block when it comes to the design.
Thank you for that. It's always helpful for a designer's perspective to understand what the developers have to go through. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you can share for most of the designers here to keep in mind when the designs are being planned to account for the various security updates and threats that have to be done at the operating system level for the different phones, for the different tablets, the different operating system platforms, the browsers. Being able to keep up with some of the latest development trends or newer coding capabilities, but at the same time being open to fulfilling the needs for anyone who's still on legacy platforms or devices.
Okay. All right. So just to repeat the question, it was how do you kind of keep up with the new things that are coming out, but also dealing with people who are working with legacy applications. So one of the things that I mentioned, that hybrid solution should be a fairly all-encompassing, embracing solution to that, because you're working with a part of the mobile operating system that tends to be more frequently updated. So that happens to be your web browser. That's the built-in web browser for any specific device. And that is not something that really is responsible or beholden to a full OS system update. So for instance, within iOS or Android, this is something that can be just processed normally through the Play Store or through the App Store. So that will go through and that'll get pushed through. And again, we're dealing with just HTML. We're just dealing with CSS. So it becomes a lot easier to do any updates and to do a manual push and an update and make sure that it works. And it's not really, again, hooked into any type of real security concern. Any type of security concern that you're dealing with, again, is based off of the browser. So any weaknesses that they might have would be inside of there. But you're creating the app. You have that control. You're not opening up, hopefully, your own applications in a way to hack your own systems. So you're trying to design this in a way that doesn't actually interfere with the OS. It's making very minimal requests. You're just handling the storage, if you're dealing with offline storage, or if you need access to the Wi-Fi, to a GPS system. So those things you should be relatively safe with, and any updates, whether you're stuck with users who are kind of pinned against a specific OS version, you should be okay. You know, it will kind of keep you protected as opposed to a full native application. But one of the things that I forgot to touch upon is if you are dealing with a massive amount of data, you know, you do have a use case that is going to translate over into a mobile device that does take advantage of a lot of information, but also needs a high level of interactivity. So for instance, just a very data dense chart. You know, people want to be able to zoom in, scroll, manipulate and twist around this kind of chart. That is one of the few times that you're really, really going to have to stick down to a native level. But for most line of business applications, and I don't want to speak for all of you, I know that a lot of you guys run into many different types of challenges. Most line of business applications, you should be able to get away with, you know, with a collaboration of design and development, be able to come up with a solution that shrinks it down into a web environment, into a mobile environment, without much of a loss of usability at the end.